Hi everyone, my name is Elisa. I'm one of the college consultants for Potomac Admissions, and today I'm going to be talking to everyone about the college admissions process and how students and their parents can navigate through this very complex and often confusing process. Before I get started, I will introduce myself. So again, my name is Elisa. As far as my own educational background, I received my Bachelor's of Arts from NYU and my law degree from University of Virginia School of Law and my Master's in Higher Education from University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. Throughout today's presentation, I'll be giving students and parents insights into the process from the college admissions standpoint, having worked in college admissions, as well as having served as a private consultant for the past decade plus. In any case, before we get started, I'm going to share my screen with everyone so that everyone can see the PowerPoint we've made. Okay, so again, our presentation is titled Navigating the College Admissions Process. Before we get started into the nitty-gritty and talking about the ins and outs of the process, I do want to give everybody a bird's eye view, a kind of an overview of our company and our success, which really speaks to the dedication and passion of both our consultants as well as our students. So in the last admissions cycle, approximately 59% of our students gained admissions into a top 20 school, including the Ivy League universities like Princeton, Yale, and Cornell. Approximately 88% of our students gained admissions into a top 30 school. Approximately 93% of our students gain admissions into a top 40 school, and approximately a mind-blowing 98% of our students gain admissions into a top 50 school. We also selected at random a few colleges to show how we stack up to just the regular national admissions rates. So compared to a national average of 9.3%, our admissions rate for University of Pennsylvania is 42%. Compared to a national average of 9.9%, our admissions rate for Duke is a 38%. Compared to a national average of 12.5%, our admissions rate for Johns Hopkins is a 27%. And compared to a national average of 15.7%, our admissions rate for Georgetown is a 72%. So again, that really goes to show everyone just our insights into the process and how dedicated our consultants are and the work and the success that they've made while working with our students. But that's really enough about us. Today's presentation is broken down into 5 parts, and throughout these sections, we'll be sharing tips and advice that we've gained from over the years. Part 1 is going to go over the academic criteria, and I'll explain in a brief moment why we start there first. Part 2 will go beyond the numbers and talk about other factors that make and contribute to the success of your application. Part 3, we'll be talking a little bit about how a student can build a college list and what are some general best practices they should keep in mind. Part 4, we'll talk about the general application timeline and kind of the due dates that students have to keep in mind. And part 5, we'll leave everybody with a little bit of parting advice as well as an explanation of the service that we offer. So part 1, academic criteria, and why does this matter? So the reason why I want to start here first is that if you imagine college admissions as like a series of gates leading up to the final destination, right? If you imagine it as a series of gates, then the first gate, the first door is what we call the academic gatekeeper. If you just don't surpass that first door, if you don't have the numbers that the schools are looking for, or you're not close to the averages that they're looking for, then it almost doesn't matter how great the rest of your application is. They're simply not going to open that first gate. So they're not going to really take an in-depth look at the rest of your application. And while this sounds very, very harsh, if you think of it from the perspective of admissions officers, it makes sense, right? They're getting literally thousands and thousands of applications. If they have to spend hours on every single application, reading every little detail of every single application, frankly, they just wouldn't be able to finish on time, right? So they have to figure out a way to weed kids out. And if your GPA and test scores are not competitive compared to the school that you're applying to, there's a high chance that they're not even going to open your application. So they won't get to see your extracurriculars or your essays and so on and so forth, because they know the answer is automatically no matter how good those things are. So that's why we start there first. The question that we want to ask ourselves is, how do we avoid that automatic no? How do I make my academic criteria, my academic profile competitive? And that's why really the first thing you want to think about when you're applying to college is, what does your academic profile look like and how competitive that profile is, and how you can make that profile even more competitive if it does need to be kind of upped a bit. Now, notice I said that there are, the language I was using, notice how I said how usually you're going to get the automatic no. There are exceptions to this. So for example, if you are getting recruited for D1 sports, you're going to be in a different pile. But for the average person, this idea that if you don't have the academic profile, you're going to get the automatic no will apply. Okay, in terms of the academic criteria, what are we talking about? We're talking about your GPA, so how high your grades are within your school, as well as how rigorous your curriculum is, right? So getting straight A's with a very easy workload of just regular classes, art and gym and things like that, that's not as easy or as difficult, sorry, that's not as difficult as getting straight A's when you have a curriculum of APs and honors classes and college level work, right? So you need to maintain high grades, but you also have to make sure that you're taking classes that are challenging, that are difficult, right? So that you really prove that you're the top of the top if your goal is to aim as high as possible for college admissions. And on that notion, your classes should also fit your narrative. So somebody who's taking, let's say, who's thinking about, let's say, a college major in engineering versus someone who's thinking about college major in psychology, they may be taking different AP classes, right? Because their end goals are different, so that makes sense. The other big portion of your academic profile is your standardized testing piece. So that includes the ACT or the SAT, and it may even include the SAT subject test, depending on the colleges that you're applying to. Now, we are in this kind of weird time with the coronavirus where schools are making exceptions to their testing policy. So whereas before there weren't that many options that were testing optional, now there are more. But I still think, to be safe, since you don't know what's going to happen in the next few months or some few years, you don't know which colleges are going to end up on your ultimate college list and whether or not they're testing optional, the safest thing is to really shoot to get the highest test scores possible, so that you don't have to limit yourself to only schools that are testing optional. With respect to SAT subject tests, they may be required depending on the colleges that you're applying to. Generally speaking, the top tier colleges, so the Ivies and the most selected schools in the nation, they're the ones who tend to recommend or require SAT subject tests. Although even then, there's a trend that more and more schools are moving away from tests, but just at least for now, if you're going to be applying to the top tier schools, you'll probably have to consider taking the SAT subject test. And how many should you take? Which SATs should you take? That all depends on your own goals and your college list. But just know that it could be another thing required of you if you're applying to the top tier colleges. Okay, so now that we've all gone through the first gate, let's say that we have the grades and the test scores necessary, so we've gone through the first gate. Now they're going to take a deeper look at your application, right? So what are the different moving pieces of your bigger application? And this is what this section is really talking about. So for this section, section 2, we're going to be talking about beyond the numbers and all the different factors that play into it. So the first thing we're going to talk about are extracurriculars. So when you apply to college, oftentimes for the top tier schools, when they look at your extracurricular profile, they're going to divide it into 3 piles. You got tier 1 activities, tier 2 activities, and tier 3 activities. Tier 1 activities are activities in which you've really excel. We're talking about national and international recognition. Tier 2 activities are activities in which you've still done really well at, but maybe the recognition isn't as high, and it's more like state or regional recognition. And tier 3 activities are activities in which you participate in that you may be recognized locally or within your school, but you're not like one of the best, individuals in whatever field you're talking about. So extracurriculars are super important to the process, especially if you're applying to these top tier colleges. And the reason why is that if we just look at the academic criteria, right, plenty of people are going to have amazing grades and test scores if they're applying to schools like Stanford and Caltech and Dartmouth and Brown, right? So we can't make a decision based on just GPA and test scores, because then everyone's going to get in if that's the only thing that they have to consider. But obviously that's not the case when we're talking about single digit admission rates, right? So then it's really the other things like extracurriculars that could set someone apart. And so a lot of extracurriculars can be done by, a lot of people. Like a lot of people do some type of sport, a lot of people do some type of music, a lot of people do chess team or debate or so on and so forth, right? So to really make sure that you're going to uniquely contribute to the school, they're going to look for students who are like uniquely good in what they do, or they do something very different, of a different degree to a different level. And that's why having a tier 1 activity, I'm not saying that every single person needs a tier 1 activity to get into one of these colleges. But what I am saying is that having a tier 1 activity can really increase your likelihood and maximize your chances of getting into one of these top tier colleges, because that's how you can set yourself apart. Now, when we talk about extracurricular activities, it includes all of the following: school clubs, clubs that you do outside of school, like a community club or a travel team, internships for sure, work experience, volunteer service. It really is anything that you do that is not required by the school, right? So even like family obligations, that's definitely a part of your extracurricular life. And when we're talking about these extracurriculars, quality definitely matters more than quantity. So for example, I would prefer a student who is, really focused on like certain things, like, maybe she's really focused on volunteer work, or maybe he's very focused on the debate team. And these are what we call spikes, that like they have, really great quality engagement in these spheres of activities. I would much rather prefer that than someone who's like the jack of all trades, but master of none. Like they're in like every single club ever, but they haven't really done exceptionally well or set themselves apart in any of them because they're being pulled too thin, right? So really prioritize quality over quantity. And in thinking about your extracurriculars, the metrics that you really want to focus on are things like leadership, longevity. So not just like starting something, quitting, starting something, quitting, starting something, quitting, but really sticking with something throughout, your years of high school. Depth and involvement. So, how is your engagement different from another student or another classmate who's doing a similar activity? And of course, passion, right? So these factors are going to come up in your resume, in your essays, in your interviews, and so forth. So you really want to make sure that your extracurricular activities are being carefully selected and that you're really spending time honing them. And the larger question that we really want people to answer, the last question on the slide, is, do your extracurricular interests align with the rest of your application narrative? So what I mean by that is, for example, somebody who's applying as pre-med versus somebody who's applying as, let's say, a history major, right? They should probably have a very different extracurricular life, right? Because their interests are so different. So whatever you're doing, it should really match with your overall profile, not just academically, but also extracurricularly as well. Now, other factors that are included in our beyond the numbers section are letters of recommendation. And these are actually super important because letters of recommendation really goes to show like how you've made an impact in the classroom, in your community, or at your internship, or wherever the letters are coming from. Letters can come from teachers, guidance counselors, employers, coaches, or alums of the colleges that you're applying to. Now, some of the tips that we have for all of y'all include asking your recommendation letters early. What I mean by early is I mean by before junior year ends. Like there's no need to ask for letters in the beginning junior year or as a freshman. That's too early. But I would not wait until fall of senior year because teachers tend to get very, very busy, and they may already have all of their requests lined up and may not be in the position to take more. So try to ask before junior year ends. A really good time to ask is right after the APs, so that your teachers are more relaxed and they don't have as much going on, and they can spend some time thinking about letters of recommendation. And that when you do ask your teachers, you should lead that conversation. You should provide details, right? You shouldn't just be like, hey, can you write me a letter? Thanks, bye, the end. Like you should really have a conversation about how the teacher has impacted you, how the class has changed you, why are you asking them for their letter, in what ways have you really gone above and beyond, right? And how do you exemplify certain traits while learning in their classroom, or the equivalent for other people, like while being on their soccer team, if you're asking your coach, and so on and so forth. All things being equal, your teacher recommendations should come from junior year teachers in core academic subjects. So not like art class and gym class. And ideally, you should have one teacher who's writing for you in a way that's relevant to your major. So for example, if you want to pursue mathematics, right, having your mathematics teacher write you a letter of recommendation will make a lot of sense. But again, this is all things being equal, meaning if everything else is equal. Like if you have not a so great relationship with your math teacher, then I would not ask because that's not going to do you any good. You should be very careful when you match letters of recommendation to particular schools. So for example, some schools don't want any letters, like the University of California, Berkeley, they don't want letters unless they explicitly ask you, and rarely do they ever ask for letters. Some schools like Georgia Tech only wants one letter. So you better not send them more than one, and you better be careful of which one you send them. Some schools like Michigan can take up to 4 letters. That doesn't mean you should send all 4 letters, but they give you the opportunity to send that many letters. And these numbers can change from year to year, but generally speaking, the whole point is you need to match the requirements of the school very carefully when you're applying. Other factors included in beyond the numbers are things like athletic abilities, right? So athletic abilities can make a huge difference on college admissions if and only if you get recruited. If you don't get recruited, then it's just any other extracurricular. Like, sure, it could liven up your application, but it's not going to make a huge difference, right? The reason why it makes a huge difference if you get recruited is that because you are uniquely contributing to the school, and the schools actually make tons of money off of athletic programs. Other abilities, really any type of exceptional talent can help in the process and give you a leg up on the competition. These include musical abilities or exceptional talents in any activities, like you could be a nationally ranked debater, for example, or an internationally ranked chess player. All these things can really help differentiate you from other great qualified candidates. Interviews could be another factor as well. Usually, I feel like students kind of put a lot of stress on themselves when it comes to interviews, like they're super nervous about it. But usually, unless you do something offensive or you completely tank the interview, most alums who do these interviews or students at school who do these interviews are not out to get you. They're not trying to like penalize you or write you a bad, letter after the fact. So oftentimes it's not going to break you. It could make you if you just had like an insanely great interview and you really were able to set yourself apart. But it still is another factor that's part of the process. Sometimes I see students every year who just get like really wrapped up in the interview and probably psych themselves out more than anything. Legacy may also impact admissions. Not every single school takes into consideration of legacy, but some do, and that could be a big factor as well, especially during the early decision process. Legacy refers to a student whose parents went to the college that they're applying to. And residency can also matter as well if you're applying to public schools. So your in-state chances are a little bit different for students versus students who are applying out of state. Okay. Of course, the biggest portion of beyond the numbers part comes down to your essays. Essays are so incredibly powerful. Essays are really powerful because they're the way that you humanize yourself. They're the one and few opportunities you have throughout the application process where you can really show the reader who you are as a person, right? Like really speak to your character, your hobbies, your passions, and not just a number on a graph. So you really want to be personable, passionate, and purposeful. I find that working with students throughout the years that this type of writing is very different from other types of writing, certainly different from like analytical writing that most students are used to in the English classroom. So think of this as a more personal narrative kind of writing. And you want to be strategic. Like you don't want to tell stories that anyone else can tell, what we call cliche essays. So what do I mean by cliche essays? So every year, for example, we see so many essays about being the underdog in a particular sport and how through hard work, the student was able to get off the bench and do something, right? That could not be more boring to me because I see like literally thousands of those and it bores me to tears, right? So I know that sounds harsh, but my whole point is try to write a story that nobody else can write. Really put your passion, your soul, your heart into it and make me feel some type of way for you, right? If I read the essay, I'm just like, oh, I just read an essay like that. Like, oh, here's another student who is writing about the sports, experience. I'm not going to remember that. right? So you really want to think and reflect upon your experiences before you write that essay. And that's honestly the bulk of what we do with students. Like we really try to figure out what is their story? What is their journey? What is their experience? And how do we convey things that are important to them that happen in their life that have shaped and molded them into who they are into a 650-word document for the Common Application, right? So it's definitely easier said than done, but you do want to be strategic through this process. Beyond the Common App essay, individual schools may also have their own prompts. So most schools, and this is just an average, it really depends on your list, but most schools require 1 to 4 additional essays. So based on that, you can see how the numbers can really easily rack up, right? Like you could go from having 1 essay to all of a sudden having 20, 30 essays if you're applying to like, let's say 9 to 12 schools, right? So be strategic, really take stock of the fact that this is going to be a process. It's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. Budget your time wisely, right? Make sure that you try your best to get a lot of this work done the summer leading up to senior year, so that in senior year, when the fall comes around and there's all of your work and classwork and extracurriculars and such, you're not going to be bogged down by doing that and now still working on your essays and applying to colleges and doing interviews and maybe even doing some last minute testing, right? So none of that sounds good to me. So you really want to try to capitalize and maximize your summer time. Keep in mind that essays can be recycled, but it's not as easy as copy and pasting because oftentimes schools, even if they have similar prompts, might have different word limits or they might have different focuses. So you really want to make sure that you don't underestimate the modification process when you turn one essay into another. But generally speaking, even students who are applying to a decent number of schools, 12 schools, usually do not have to write more than 5 to 6 core essays that they use as their base that they change over and over again. Okay. So this brings us to the third part of our presentation, where we're going to be talking a little bit about how to build a college list. So this is super, super important, right? Because your college list should be ambitious, right? But also has to be realistic. We don't want to be in a situation where you completely overshot and you're ending up in a doomsday scenario where you didn't get to any college. Now, in the last 10 plus something years that we've been working with students, we've never been in that situation with any student. And hopefully we could keep it that way. So this is why we say be ambitious, but also realistic, right? Like look at the data, look at the GPA, look at the test scores. Really ask yourself if you're being realistic. If you're multiple standard deviations off of the test score and GPA, that means you're probably going to be an automatic no, right? That means that like really nothing that can really be done to avoid that no, right? But even if you have like the best, the top, like perfect GPA and test scores, recognize that if you're applying to top tier schools, nothing's a guarantee. Schools in the top 2025 of United States rankings should be reach schools for every single person. So for example, I don't care if you have perfect grades in GPA, all the Ivies are reach schools for you because we're talking about sometimes single digit admissions rate. A school, for example, that is in the top 20, like an MIT or a Caltech, right? Even if they're not Ivies, those are going to be reach schools for everyone. Georgetown, Berkeley, Emory, reach schools for everyone, right? Even if you have the grades and test scores, because people who are applying who are really competitive have that too, right? So when we're building that college list, we really, really want to think about these things and be realistic. So there are going to be 3 types of schools that make up your college list. There are safety schools. Safety schools are schools in which you should feel really comfortable getting in. It's a safe shot, right? Like your GPA and test scores is way above what they're looking for. Target schools are kind of like Goldilocks just right. And even if you have high GPA and test scores, again, no school in the top 25 should be a target school. They're all reach schools, okay? But target schools outside, that means outside of schools in the top 2025, they kind of match your GPA and test score, and they have a healthy admissions rate. They cannot have a single digit admissions rate. You cannot call a school with a single digit admissions rate or really admissions rate but below 20% a target school. And of course, there are reach schools. Reach schools sound exactly like that, right? Like you have to reach for it. It's kind of difficult to get in. It has low admissions rate, or the GPA and test scores are slightly above what you have. Generally speaking, when we work with students, we advise that they apply to at least 6 schools so that they get 2 of each category. But we would like for them to apply to 9 or more so that they can have more reach schools and really maximize their chances. So they may have 2 targets, 2 safeties, and then the rest could be reach schools, right? So that they can add multiple schools and maximize their chance of getting into a reach school. But of course, there's really no one size fits all. You really got to do what's best for you. Students have different profiles, different goals, different considerations. And in the end, that all means different strategies based on the student. But again, I cannot caution people enough. Key here is to be honest with yourself and be realistic while still being ambitious. When you're thinking about the college list, you should also really research the programs and specialties, as well as make the most out of campus visits. Yeah, I know coronavirus is a little bit, hindering that. We really can't do campus visits, at least in person, but there's a wealth of online resources that you can do virtual campus visits, because the point here is that we want the school to be a good academic fit for you and a good social fit for you. So when we work with our students, we ask a lot of questions about their personal preferences, like, where do you prefer to live? Like, what parts of the country? Do you like city school? Do you like suburban schools? Do you like big schools, small school? Is Greek life important to you, right? And so a lot of times when the student is first starting out in the process, sometimes they don't even know how to answer those questions, because they may be like, I don't really know the difference between a city school and a suburban school. I don't know the advantage of having Greek life or not having it, right? So we could definitely talk to you about all of that and explaining like what the difference of these factors are, what the advantages and disadvantages are. But deep down, only you know if that thing affects you personally and it's a personal factor, right? Like, for example, some people prefer to go to a school in the north. Some people want to go to a school in the south. There's no wrong or right, just personal preferences, right? So when you're building that college list, the best way of making sure that college list fits you is to really think about all these different factors that affect how happy you would be on campus, how comfortable you would feel on campus. And on the academic side, making sure that we're being realistic. Now, when we talk about research and programs on the academic side, what we mean by that is really think about, what you're going to apply as, like the strategies, right? Not just thinking about the school overall, but particular majors, because applying to a particular major over another major could be much more difficult. So let me just give you an example. Especially if you are of a certain demographic, like Asian American males, right? They tend to have a very saturated representation in STEM majors. So if you're applying as an engineering student, as an Asian American male, you're going to have a substantially harder admission cycle than other students, applying to different majors, or versus you applying to a different major. So these are strategic decisions that we have to talk about and think about. Are you as strong as a candidate? Is this really your end goal? Do you mind going into another major and potentially transferring into another school? How solid is this goal, right? Do you like the school more than the major? And these questions might depend on the school you're applying to. For some schools, you might apply as an engineering major. For other schools, you might do something different, right? To increase your chances. So that's really part of the research process. And those are conversations we have with students all the time to really make sure that their strategy is strategic, maximize their chances, but also really fits them as a student and as a person. Now, having said all of that, and this is just the college list, and even that could take like a lot of discussions back and forth and back and forth. So the next thing that we're going to talk about in terms of advice is get started early and stay organized. This is a long, long process. This is the second time I'm saying it. It probably won't be the last. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So get started early and stay organized. Okay. Speaking of, deadlines and timelines, the next section of our presentation is going to be about the application timeline. Now, we bring this up as part of our presentation because it really stresses the last point, which is get started early and stay organized. So what we're going to do is kind of work backwards. First, talk about the deadlines and then explain what those implications are and how students should work throughout their years of high school and summer to get ready for this crazy process. So the most kind of like common timeline, right? The default option is regular decision, in which case most applications are due between January and February of one senior year. There's also early decision, in which case most applications are due between October and December of one senior year. The most popular deadline is November 1st. Early decision is binding, meaning if you apply to early decision and you get in, you have to go. you must attend this school. In fact, if you get in an early decision, you have an obligation to withdraw your applications for schools that you may have already applied to and not apply to any more regular decision schools. So why would somebody bind themselves? Why would they elect this option? Well, you find out earlier, so it might be less stress. It could also boost your chance of admissions. Now, it is not going to work miracles. So if you're not otherwise academically qualified, it is not going to work miracles. But if you're right on the edge, early decision can help you. Early decision usually I see higher admission rates compared to regular. And that's because, quite honestly, schools are selfish, meaning that they care a lot about their yield. The school's yield measures how many accepted students accepted their acceptances, okay? So if I, as a school, let's say, gave out 10 acceptances and nobody accepted my acceptances, my yield is going to look pretty bad and my ranking is going to drop. But if I, as a school, release 10 acceptances and all 10 accept, that's great for my yield. I have 100% yield and my rankings are going to go up, right? No school is at 100%, not even Harvard. My whole point is that how a school does with yield affects their rankings, right? So early decision looks really attractive for schools because for every early decision applicant I accept, they have to accept me. It's a legally binding contract that they sign when they apply as early decision. Early action, similar to early decision, happens earlier in the process. So again, similar to early decision, the deadlines usually are between October to December, with the most common being November 1st. But unlike early decision, early action is not binding. So you apply earlier, you may find out earlier, but it's not binding. You don't have to go. There are variations of it. So sometimes, for example, some schools such as Princeton, Stanford, Harvard have what we call restrictive early action, where it's not binding like early decision. But if you apply to these schools as early action under their restrictive early action policy, you have to promise that you're not applying to any other private school early. You can apply to public schools early because, let's be honest, that's not really their competition, right? But if you decide, for example, to apply to Stanford early action, you cannot apply to any other school, early action, or early decision, with the exception of public schools. You can still early to public schools. So some students will take this up on their offer because they may want to really try to increase their chances. But again, the difference between chances you see in early action isn't as pronounced as early decision because there is no binding, so there's no benefit increasing the school's yield. Nevertheless, students may still apply early action for similar benefits, finding out early, potentially less stress, potentially a small bump in admissions, and also bigger chance of getting scholarships because you're part of the early pool, so you just have more chances and you show more interest in the school. Now, the other way in which a college admissions timeline work is that this is the less common offer, but there are schools that have rolling applications, which just means first come, first serve. So when their window opens, the students who apply earlier are more likely to get in because there's more spots, right? So by the time like 3-4 months have gone by, you can apply, but there are fewer spots now because they're taking people as a first come, first pass basis. Okay, so this has been a very kind of quick and dirty in and out process of the college admissions process. Obviously, the process itself gets a lot more complicated than this. There's a whole aspect like that we haven't talked about in detail, like filling out the actual application, what kind of strategies we should use, and how do we prioritize extracurriculars, and how do we highlight leadership and things like that. But I think this is a great starting point to have a conversation about what type of colleges you want to apply to, how many colleges should be on your list, what kind of narrative should you be thinking about? What kind of factors should you be thinking about throughout high school to prepare for this monumental aspect of your life? So before we end the presentation, I want to leave everyone with a little bit of parting advice. The following include maintain a good GPA. GPA is so important part of the process. It's also something that can be easily ruined, right? Like once you have a really bad year, it's a cumulative process. So it's much harder to increase your GPA over the years, right? And also, unlike testing, you can't redo it. You could maybe retake a class 1 or 2 times based on your school's policies, but you can't just retake all of your classes. That's going to look suspect, right? So try to maintain a high GPA while still keeping up with a rigorous course load. Try to complete all of your testing, so SAT, ACT, and subject testing by the end of junior year. This is so that when we go into the summer before senior year, we're going in with all of your data. We don't have any questions or uncertainty, right? Because then if we have all that data, we can figure out what is a safety school, reach school, or target school. If we don't have that data, we're kind of operating blind, right? And that's pretty dangerous for the summer going to senior year, because without that college list, we don't know which colleges they're applying to. And without that, we don't know how many essays or which essays you should be writing for. So we don't want to write blindly, but we also don't want to waste time, the precious time you have in the summer, which is, usually there are fewer distractions, right? So really try to complete all of your testing by the end of junior year, and try to spread your testing out so that you're not in this doomsday scenario junior year where you're taking SAT and subject tests and APs, and also you have quizzes and other assignments going on in school. That's a recipe for disaster. So really try to spread this out throughout your high school. Build your resume, right? Think about your extracurricular life. Make sure, and this might sound a little bit contradicting, but make sure that you're well-rounded but focused. So what I mean by that is that make sure that you have spikes, right? Quality is more important than quantity. Like really try to have tier 1 activities, but also make sure that you don't just do one thing your entire extracurricular life. Like you only do debate and nothing else, right? Like debate's awesome, it's great, but you should have more than just 1 or 2 activities, right? So make sure that you have a diverse range of experiences, that you're really putting yourself out there, but that we don't then go to the other deep end where you have all these activities but no quality to it, no depth to it. So really try to make sure that you have spikes, that you're focused, but you have more than just a handful of activities. On that note, try to go get life experience. Challenge yourself. Do something new and different. Be bold. Don't just do the same activities that your friends are. Try to stand out from the crowd, right? You could do a research internship. You can enroll in summer pre-college program. You can study abroad. There's plenty of things that you can do that can really help you find your passions and help you find your purpose, while still also making you different and unique from other people. And the biggest piece of advice that I can leave everybody with is really start the application process early on. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And just like all major decisions in life, like buying a house, right, or starting retirement, we should be planning years ahead of that, right? So even though you're not applying to college until senior year, and therefore you're not, doing all of the application process, writing essays and so on and so forth until second half of junior year, you can see that a lot of these things like your extracurriculars, like your GPA, and even your test scores happen way before that, right? It's a build up, right? So you can't just like not do any extracurriculars and then senior year join every single club under the sun. That's not going to work. So really invest in yourself and start the process early on. Okay, as for our services, prior to junior year, we engage students in long-term planning. So we think about their test prep strategy, their test prep timeline, when do they take what test and why. We think about their high school coursework, what classes are they taking in high school and why. We think about the rigor, we think about the fit to the narrative, whether their classwork and their narrative makes sense together. We think about their extracurriculars. Can we flip something into tier 1 activities? We think creatively about how we can help a student uniquely set themselves apart. We think about summer planning. So, can they do pre-college programs, internships like we talked about? How are they spending this like bulk of 3-month period when they're not in school? And these are things that everyone should be thinking about. So even if you're not working with us, we really recommend having conversations with parents about long-term college planning. And then once junior year hits around the corner and we have data, so we have the very solid GPA, we have the test scores and such, we work with students on college admissions to build an ambitious but very balanced college list. So again, we want to be realistic, okay? And we really want to make the most strategic decisions possible to maximize their chances. So we want to think critically about where you're going to EAAD and why. We're going to think critically about what your choice of major is and why, and the implications these decisions have on how difficult or how less difficult your process will be. And during this process, we also work with students to plan well thought out campus visits, assuming coronavirus isn't a concern, that you can actually go on campus, or virtual campus visits as well as additional follow-up. So we engage with students and work with them to make sure that we can show demonstrated interest, and also collect information for our own purposes, like details that you get on college visits that you can later use for your college essay. So for example, if we work with you to plan a visit where You get to observe a class or talk to a professor or talk to a student leader. These are all things that you should mention in your later essay to really signify a connection to the school and set yourself apart. And we also work with students to develop and construct a holistic resume, but that's also focused. And the bulk of what we do is that we work with students a lot on their essay writing process. That includes brainstorming and outlining, editing and re-editing, correcting and modifying essays. That's definitely the most heavy lifting that takes the most amount of time. We also work with students to manage all their applications and due dates. We also do a final review of everything. So in all my years of working with students, and I've worked with like really responsible superstar students, right? I've never had anybody who was able to do their applications perfectly. And that makes sense, right? Because there's just so much going on. There's a lot of applications for you to fill, right? We're all human. So I think it's super helpful to do a final review to really make sure that we don't have something silly like we have students, believe it or not, who mistype their own names, who mistype their addresses, who mistype their parent names or their school names and so forth. So we do a final review of everything, and none of our students hit the submit button until we literally give them a green light and say, okay, you can submit now. We also help prepare students for interviews, as well as students to help them deal with deferrals and waitlists, what additional actions to take. And of course, my all-time favorite part, I think the funnest part about my job, is to provide guidance on post-admissions decision-making. So you're in, what kind of decisions and options should you have, and what may make most sense to your personal fulfillment and your personal goals. That's definitely my favorite part of the job because it's definitely the most joyous part of the job. So in any case, that concludes our presentation, and I really want to thank everyone for attending our workshop. We'll be following up with everybody, so if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to get in contact with us, and we wish all the students the best of luck and that they have really successful college admission journeys.